2 years ago, the soil in my garden looked like this: heavy, dense clay, almost like concrete, with just about no drainage capability. Today it looks like this: loose, friable soil, thanks to lots and lots of organic matter and worms. The soil in my garden is clay, specifically London clay. So let's start by taking a look at what it is and where it came from. Clay is one of the three main soil types, the other two being sand and loam. Most soil has elements of all three soil types, and it's the percentage of each element that determines the texture of the soil. Clay is mineral rich. London clay typically contains crystalline kaolinite, illite, chlorite, smectite, and montmorillonite. The clay may contain iron sulfite, calcium carbonate, and also gypsum. And it was deposited in the Eocene epoch, so that was around 30 million years ago, and forms what's referred to as the London Basin. So the clay is rich in minerals, but in its unamended form it doesn't naturally contain much organic matter. Its capacity to hold water and its compaction and hardness when it dries out means that most plants have a very difficult time in clay soils. I found it impossible to get a shovel or spade into this, and ended up using both a large and small mattock just to break the clay up. Soil particles are the smallest of all the soil types, typically just 0.002 millimeters, meaning there's more particles for any given amount of space. So clay tends towards compaction very easily, and the particles and minerals, when wet, they expand, causing problems for the roots by severely reducing drainage capacity and the ability of any air to circulate. Its density also means that it's slow to warm up when temperatures start to rise in the spring and summer. Just as in the air we breathe, nitrogen, oxygen and carbon dioxide are found in the pockets of air between the soil particles. Here's a comparison of the soil gases compared to the atmospheric gases. Slightly more nitrogen in the soil due to the actions of nitrogen-fixing microbes, slightly less oxygen in the soil than in the atmosphere, and significantly more carbon dioxide in the soil than in the atmosphere. Getting oxygen into the soil is critical because it allows for respiration of both the plant roots and soil organisms. The aerobic microbes in the soil need oxygen, and some play a role, as mentioned, in fixing nitrogen in the soil. When water enters the soil, it occupies these air pockets, and as it drains or is taken up by the plant roots, these pockets refill with air. Where there's a predominance of clay, however, this is a problem, since the clay particles expand when wet, meaning draining is very slow. Surface flooding is common, and it's consequently much more difficult for air to penetrate into the soil than compared to, for example, sandy or loamy soils. In poorly aerated soils, when carbon dioxide builds up, this can have a negative effect on the water absorption ability of the plant, and oxygen deficiency also disturbs the metabolism of the plants, causing poor growth. So these are the problems I inherited with the clay in the garden. To improve the drainage, the nutrient value and the airflow, I simply needed to do two things. One, add lots and lots and lots of organic matter. Two, increase the population of worms in the soil by giving them lots and lots and lots of nutrient-rich compostable material to work on. So number two inevitably follows on from number one, so let's start with the organic matter. And as we do that, keep in mind what you're looking at here is exactly how the clay in my garden was just 2 years ago. When I say organic matter, I'm referring to any material that has come from the remains of plants and animals, including their waste product. In the case of plants, we're talking about stems, leaves, roots, that kind of stuff, all compostable. And in terms of animal manures, you can use any waste product from herbivores. So that could be cow manure, it could be sheep manure, it could be bedding from small animals such as guinea pig bedding, it could be chicken manure, and of course it could be your own homemade compost, which is one of the best soil amendments that you could use. My manure of choice is horse manure, and that's for no other reason other than I can get lots of it quite easily and quite near where I live. Adding organic matter to the clay soil adds carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen and oxygen, and results in a dramatic increase in the microbial life of the soil. Through the action of the bacteria and fungi, nutrients are released that are now in a more plant-accessible form, and the structure of the soil itself starts to change through the actions of the micro and macro organisms. So we're adding organic matter, the clay is becoming more aerated, more oxygen is getting through and to a deeper level, which in turn improves drainage and helps feed the rapid growth of microorganisms. And suddenly this dull, limp clay is becoming very attractive to the best soil engineers on the planet, the worms. So let's take a look now at the different worms that are working in my clay soil and the beneficial effect that they are having. The garden squad working my clay soil are anisic, endogoeic and epigoeic worms, which also includes compost bin worms. They're the perfect team in many ways because they all work at different levels in the soil, but they all end up adding nutrient-rich casts which builds the soil. Darwin was one of the first to observe a healthy population of earthworms in an acre of land can churn something in the region of 15 tonne of soil over the course of a year. Other research shows a single worm can add as much as 10 pounds of casts per year to the soil, so it's easy to see how the action of worms can significantly change the structure of the soil over time. So let's start with the anisic worms. These worms are the largest worms that we have in the UK. They live in the soil, making vertical burrows that can be several metres deep. These burrows are more or less permanent. The anisic worm will drag material from the surface into their burrow, feeding on the bacteria and fungi that are on it. So those nutrients from these leaves and plant matter may end up being taken a metre or more deep into the clay. They typically leave their casts on the surface, close to the entrance of their burrow, which they also plug up to protect it, and will come to the surface when conditions are right to find feeding material and find a partner. Endogoeic worms. These worms also live in the soil, but unlike the anisic worms, they make horizontal burrows and will make new burrows as the old ones become filled with casts. Whereas anisic worms leave their casts on the surface, these worms leave their casts in the horizontal burrows that they make, creating numerous horizontal, nutrient-rich filled subsurface tunnels over time. Of particular importance when it comes to my clay soil is these worms derive their nutrients from the soil itself. They're eating the soil and extracting the minerals and nutrients from it. Epigoeic worms, which includes the compost bin worms. These worms are typically smaller than the anisic or endogoeic worms, which gives them more adaptability for the environmental conditions that they live in, usually very close to or actually on the surface, so they can handle the fluctuations in moisture and temperatures found on the surface better than the anisic or endogoeic worms. They can be found on the piles of compostable materials such as leaves, grass clippings, decaying plant materials and manures. However, these worms have never read the textbooks that we've written about them, so epigoeic worms don't know that they're supposed to have weak burrowing skills. I've found epigoeic worms as deep as 2 feet from the surface in my worm pit in quite compacted material. What we know as the composting worms, inverted commas, the worms that we typically have in our worm bins, these are a type of epigoeic worm. And once again, while these have adapted to live in the softer environment of the compost bin or pile of decaying organic material, I know my escapees, the ones that at least manage to avoid the birds, end up living quite happily in the garden, so long as there's organic matter for them to work on at or near the surface. Epigoeic worms are voracious feeders and reproducers, and they can consume their own body weight in compostable material every day, meaning they're adding vast amounts of top quality worm casts to the clay mix. These 3 groups of worms working in harmony are turning and tilling the clay. They're pulling organic matter deep into the clay and processing and mixing organic matter on the surface. They're adding huge amounts of nutrients via their casts that are simultaneously altering the dense structure of the clay, and they're creating drainage and aeration due to their vertical and horizontal tunnelling activity. Water now drains quicker and more easily, and plant roots have an easier time as their roots can reach down and find the nutrient-packed aerated tunnels made by the worms. Worm casts have been shown to have significantly higher levels of plant-available nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium than the surrounding soil. The plants now have more nutrients available to them, and most importantly in a more accessible form. In October 2017, Miss Sprinkles was adding fish and bone meal to the dense waterlogged clay in an effort to add some nutrient value to it so that we could get planting. Just 2 years later, this is October 2019, the clay is so friable that Miss Sprinkles is able to harvest all these potatoes on her own, just using her hands. And every time she delves into the clay to pull up some potatoes, she's pulling up worms as well. Every year since 2017, I've been adding several inches of horse manure to the clay beds in the garden. The manure will feed the epigeic and composting worms. The nutrients and added bacteria from the manure being added to the clay soil will feed the endogeic worms, who extract the nourishment they need by dining on the soil itself. And to keep the anisic worms happy, Miss Sprinkles here is adding some shredded leaves that are about 2 years old, well on their way to being leaf mould, so packed with bacteria and fungi that the anisic worms love. I've not needed to add any additional fertilizer to anything growing in these beds. All this has been achieved with the absolute minimal effort and input from us. From thick, dense, nutrient-poor London clay to rich, nutrient-packed, loose, friable soil that produces awesome vegetables and fruits with no additional fertilizers in as little as 2 years. No problem. Just add manure and let the worms do the rest. As always, thanks for watching. Bye for now.